Thank you for the organizing committee to give me the opportunity to speak about the general context of sunflower production. I mean, it's always useful to know where we are, to imagine where we could go in the future. So we shall examine the past and present and give some perspective for the future. So I will speak about many things, from the situation of sunflower production, yields, oil consumption, sunflower meals, trade prices, etc. And we shall finish with some consideration of the present situation due to the conflict in Ukraine and the place of this country in the production. Well, let us remind some obvious things. Sunflower gives both vegetable oils and proteins. We have an oil market which is led by palm oil, and then in the second position soybean oil as a byproduct of soybean meal proteins. The protein market for mainly food feed is led by soybean. Then we have some strong developments for some years on non-food uses of crop products, which are developing as mass products today. If we think about biodiesel, we have also some biorefinery approaches to develop other renewable and sustainable products. And then the sunflower production is only an element in the global agriculture and food system. If we have a short look to this global agriculture and food system, we have to consider on the left side of this slide the oil and protein sources which compete between each other. You have rapeseed, you have soybean, you have palm, you have many things. There is a transformation, well, all these give some offer concerning the lipids, proteins, glucids, etc. And then you have utilization of all these things with food, consumption of lipids, food, protein consumptions. You have non-food uses and so on. And all this, I mean, the value chain itself is submitted to a context which includes policies, dietary habits, changes in populations, demography, actors and different strategies, etc. Some years ago, we had some foresight studies, and we imagined several scenarios, and we imagined an ocean of oil scenario and a real lack of protein at global scale. So maybe it's time to reconsider these things and see if there is really a lack of, well, lack of protein. I think it is really obvious for the future. Ocean of oil, maybe we should consider a second time. So, first thing of all, sunflower seed production. Well, let us say that sunflower seeds, as all oilseeds in the world, you have here a graph representing the evolution of oilseed production in the world, only oilseeds. The fact is that oilseeds production followed the global demand for all the uses for food and for non-food uses at world level. So it's a very bright performance to follow all these, I mean, to succeed in following all this demand. The fact what we can see on this slide is that sunflower reached about 10% of oilseeds between 1985 and 1995, and then stabilized around 9% of the global oilseed production. At the same time, we had a big increase of soybean production, more than 60%, if we consider the things in the last 2 decades. And there is a relative decrease of cottonseed. So we can conclude that sunflower has followed the general trend with success. we are not out of the game. It's a very good point. Then, if we look at the sunflower itself, now we reach about 50 million tons per year and 26 million hectares. So it's also a big performance if we consider that within the last 2 decades, the production has been multiplied by 2.3, the acreage by 1.4, and the yield by 1.6. So I mean we are on the right trend for the production of sunflower. Just to find. Yeah. Another aspect of the sunflower seed production it is that today it is a relatively spatially concentrated crop. Well, sunflower is grown significantly in 63 countries in the world. So it's a big number of countries, but 80% of the production is in the top 10 countries. And 2/3 of it, of the production is in Europe. So it's spatially very concentrated production. Even if, of course, if we have some leading countries outside Europe, notably Argentina and China, for example, and the United States. Yeah. So the evolution of yields. Well, if you look at the first graph, we can. It is the annual evolution of yields in the different top 10 countries. So if you look at this graph, of course, well, you can see a general tendency to a yield growth. Okay. Then, if we examine the average 5-year value of these yields, the average, I think, 5 years. Well, it's more readable, but it's well, you cannot distinguish really what happens. So we can sort these curves in 3 categories. You have some countries which include Ukraine, Russia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Serbia, Turkey, with relatively constant progression of yields. And today, these countries have really, during the last 2 decades, really progressed in yields. Then you have a second category of countries which started a bit later in yield progression, Argentina, USA, China, Romania, but which are now progressing actively in yields. And we have 3 countries on the top 10 with a stagnation, in fact, of the yields. So you have France, which is still at a relatively high yield level, but stagnating and even decreasing now. So it's, we have some warnings, and maybe you will have some explanations of these situations in the speech of my friend Vincent Lecomte, and also Philippe Devec told you about some elements about the situation this morning. And then we have Spain and South Africa, which know some other conditions for drawing effects and for edaphic conditions. So it's countries which are now facing, I think, pedoclimatic conditions not so fun. If we consider oil consumption, well, I mean, all the production has been absorbed, of course, so you have the same trend as for seeds production, but here we add the palm oil, which is the leading oil on the market today, in blue on these graphs. So we examined these things, and we see that sunflower oil is the 4th oil in the world as edible oil, oil consumed for food and non-food uses. Today, the vegetable oil and fats, and fat production at the world level, including fats, is about 244 million tons, and vegetable oils represent 80% of this oil. We see that during the last 3 years, beginning in 2019, there is a kind of stabilization of the production, but the scale is not the same because the last 3 columns, in fact, are only the last 3 years. And before it was every 5 years on the scale x-axis. But it seems that there is a kind of slowdown on this sunflower oil consumption. Well, where sunflower oil is used, well, almost everywhere in the world. Even if some countries have a bigger share of sunflower oil consumption in their lipid consumptions. What about the meals? Meals, of course, soybean is the king, but sunflower has also a good rank. It is ex aequo, let us say, with cottonseed meal between the 3rd and 4th rank. And it represents about 20% of global meal production in the world, with 20 million tons. And main importers for these sunflower meals are EU, Turkey, China, and other states of the Community of Independent States. We had some information yesterday about the quality of oilseed meals, and we saw that there are today even some possibilities to go with higher protein contents, even by the actual protein contents of high-pro meals. High-pro meals today are not so far from soybean meal quality, and with some technical improvements, it will be almost soybean meal. I mean, if we follow what Sylvie Leguet told us yesterday. There are still some possibilities to improve it. So, well, let us say a bright perspective for sunflower meal, if we want to see these things about among the all protein sources. And this is the most demanding use for protein sources because it is on poultry use. This is metabolizable energy for cockerels and protein percentage. An important point to understand the things is the trade aspects. Sunflower seeds, in fact, are more, well, sunflower is a commodity which is really more traded in the world and which is traded differently than the other oilseeds. It is traded mainly as oil and meal and very few as seeds. Comparatively, you take soybean, you take oilseed rape, it's much more traded as seeds. Only 5% of the seeds are exported out of the production countries. It means that industrial development has accompanied, in fact, the sunflower seed production. So, well, I will not insist on this diagram, which shows the main flows. I think it was in 2019. The main commercial flows for the trade of oilseed rape and sunflower as seeds or cakes. Prices. So prices, you will see that we had a big increase in prices since May 2020. So I mean the phenomenon of price increase that we observe today is an exacerbation of something which was existing before this date. So we had a relatively poor situation concerning the stocks of sunflower meal and of sunflower oil, sorry, and this has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Another things to comment on this graphic is that some years ago, sunflower oil was the most expensive oil. In fact, it was at a higher level than soybean, of course, and even rapeseed. And for the last years, I mean the periods where I put some red marks, I mean, it is overpassed by rapeseed, notably. So certainly rapeseed is helped by the production of biodiesel. So the premium of sunflower oil is not the same today, and it is cheaper. If we observe what happens on biodiesel, on the right side of this graph, you have it comes from the Oil World 2022, the last edition of Oil World. So you have total production of oil and fats, no? And in blue you have the biodiesel production, the use for biodiesel. The white, the yellow, and the red is food and other production. So you see that this increase in proportion of biodiesel uses of oil and fats. So today, with 48 million tons of biodiesel, of which 40 are based on first-use vegetable oils, biodiesel absorbs about 20% of the global vegetable oil production, which is 193 million tons, actually. So in fact, it's really a big push in prices for vegetable oils, especially rapeseed. But it is a general trend for oil oils. So biodiesel does not concern sunflower directly, because sunflower is not very much used in biodiesel, maybe 600,000 tons at the scale of European Union, which is one of the main producers of biodiesel, at least with vegetable oils, from oilseeds, except palm oil, because it's limited by some technical characteristics for sunflower. But it is concerned because of the price evolutions of the vegetable oil complex. Delays. Okay. Be patient. So oleic sunflower, I will not insist too much because we have not so much information on this point. Well, I have not so much information. Well, it is pulled by the demand of food industries. We knew a rapid development in France some years ago, and then in Ukraine and Russia. What is important is that the high oleic sunflower oil is the richest oil among oleic oils. So this is a good point for sunflower, oleic sunflower. Today we have to consider also that the food industries develop the use of blends, not pure oleic sunflower oils, which is a kind of internal competition, let us say, regarding high oleic sunflower oil. It represents today about 20% of the sunflower oil consumed in Europe. Confectionery sunflower, it's a developing market, but we have some statistical difficulties to evaluate exactly. We got some information from a company in China some years ago in Wuhan Symposium, and I compared this data with Oil World statistical data. So if we make a calculation and consider the ratio of, Oil World statistics consider in fact crushing and other uses. So normally confectionery type is a part of the other uses, in which you have to include bakery, seeds for birds, and so on. Other uses represent about 10% of the global sunflower production, sunflower seeds production. If I compare with the Chinese data I got in Wuhan, it means that the confectionery sunflower could represent about 40% of these other uses. So it would reach about 2.2 million tons per year if we consider these Oil World statistics and cross the things. The figures given yesterday by Dr. Etienne lead to a higher estimation of these quantities, about 5 million tons in fact. So there is certainly a difficulty to estimate, but we should say at least 2-3 million tons for confectionery, probably more. But the OIWA statistic probably do not catch all the quantities. So it's still a niche market corresponding to national food habits, but it should lead to also to a higher interest in protein contents, and this may be an advantage for future. What about the situation in Ukraine and Russia? Well, we have to consider that today Ukraine and Russia together represent 80% of sunflower oil and meals exports at the world level. So, given this information, you understand very easily, the complexity of the situation and the drama in fact it is for the sunflower market and the countries importing sunflower. Ukraine alone represents 49% of oil exports and 57% for sunflower meals. So this is the situation. You have the yellow circle is the production of sunflower oil in 2010, and the green part is the imports. So in fact, if you add the two, and the balance of imports, so you have, let us say, the production and consumption at the same time for the countries. At least the production, the resources at the scale of the countries. So this is the situation in 2010. So Ukraine was representing 3 million tons for production and exporting 2.5 million tons. Russia 2.7 and 0.5. For a global oil production of 12.6 million tons and 4.9 million ton exports. The situation in 2020 is the following. It's to say that global production has been multiplied in a decade by 1.7, global imports by 2.8, and especially export from Ukraine by 2.6, and import from Russia by 7.4. So it means that within a decade, a real dependency, interdependency was created and exacerbated by the rise of the production in Russia and Ukraine, the two together. So you see some countries became very dependent, in fact, on oil imports from these two countries. And these are the countries which are really dependent. So these are the imports in yellow from Ukraine, in red from Russia. And you see that, for example, India imports huge quantities from Ukraine and smaller from Russia. And Egypt, for example, also is a big customer for these two countries. Europe also is a big customer for the country. Turkey also, and so on. And you have many other countries in the Middle East which are, of course, imports smaller quantities because they have a smaller population, but relatively speaking, these imports are very important for them. And today, this is the situation. So before it was 2010, today 2020. You can see the change. It's within 10 years. It's extraordinary. So the first effect was, in fact, the price, an effect on the structure of the exports. Ukraine cannot export oil anymore, so it begins to export seeds. You have here the trend of exports for oil and seeds from September to August with the different years. So in red, you have the present year. So first, disruption of markets. Then I can advise to you, if you are interested by this issue, to read this paper from IFPRI MENA working group, published in May 2022, on the vulnerability map of the different countries relatively to this crisis. So they examine, in fact, the short-term and long-term vulnerability regarding oil imports, milkseed imports, and also fertilizers. So in fact, all the countries are more or less concerned, but the most concerned in the short term are in red on this map for food imports on short term. So it's mainly Middle East and even parts of Mongolia. But the paper itself is very interesting. I advise you to read it. So, effect of the war, the main point is the immediate surge on the global food and fertilizer prices, the consumption decisions which are affected because of higher price of low availability of the products. We have also observed some inappropriate policy responses which could exacerbate the situation, like export bans or even biodiesel mandates. In this situation, we could raise the question, is it necessary to, or is it relevant to maintain biodiesel mandates, at least for this period? And according to FAO, this war may spark a global food crisis, food security crisis. So I had some look at the situation of different countries. So if we take India, the sunflower oil imports are in yellow here, so you can see it's limited part limited relative part. But if you consider the quantity, it's something like 2 million tons. So that's not nothing. For China, it's more balanced. They import a lot of, in their imports a lot of palm oil, much less sunflower. If we observe for Egypt and Iraq, well, Egypt is not so much dependent on I mean, from Russia it is in red, from Ukraine in yellow, and from other countries in top yellow at the top of the graphic. Well, for Egypt it is a big part of their imports, and the situation is even dramatic for a country like Iraq, even if the population is smaller, because you see that sunflower oil represents at least 50% of their consumption. And these countries are also much more concerned by cereals. So coming back to longer term, what could be the perspective? So what about this scenario of ocean of oil I was evocating at the beginning? We can consider that the rapid development of biodiesel as an alternative energy makes the scenario more remote, in fact. It should need fine-tuning to adapt and to manage this market of sunflower oil without too much prices crisis. But in fact, today, if we consider the evolution with biodiesel, there is no notion of oil. Everything is used, and there is a trend to use even more. And we can observe that there is also a slowdown on food consumption, maybe due to the prices. So there is a regulation probably at the detriment of food users, and this could be a problem. In the last decade, the biodiesel development absorbed the equivalent of 70% of the increase in palm oil production. So this is also very important because, I mean, even if it is an equivalent, it means that the ocean of oil that we could imagine due to the production of palm oil, in fact, is not so certain. Then we consider that the growth of palm oil production would range between 20 and 30 million tons by 2030, and that in the same time, the food users to meet the population should grow of about 2% per year. It's to say about 20 to 25 million tons by 2030. So if it is not constrained by the high prices or local availability. So it means that the palm oil perspective and the food users perspective is almost at the same level. So you see the ocean of oil is not so certain. And then we have oleochemistry, maybe a possibility. You have already today licenses existing for vegetable oil-based plastics, which are already available with industrial tests. There is a price competition, etc. For plastics, it's a matter of cost of vegetable oils. But anyway, I mean, you have many outlets in this vegetable oil, which are very high-value products. Then we have to consider, of course, that humanity still faces a global protein challenge to meet the needs of the population and to limit also the greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to consider feed and direct uses for food. So sunflower has the double advantage to be already consumed for food. If we consume vegetable protein for food instead of animal proteins, it's very efficient to decrease the emissions due to the food consumption. So sunflower has a big advantage for this because it is both non-GMO, so better accepted, and it is already consumed as a food. If we consider confectionery sunflower, for example. And there is no doubt about developing added value from the protein fraction today, even as direct food users or protein extracts. Protein extracts which will be in competition with peas, soybean, rapeseed. And with regard to climate change, sunflower could improve in northern latitudes, but be affected in medium term in southern and eastern Europe, as Philip and other colleagues mentioned. So we have to consider also adaptation of cropping practices and diversity of cultivars for long term for this crop. Okay, so I finish. Yeah. So thank you for listening.